Hello, this is Faith at Faith and Books. I just finished reading Romola by George Eliot. Excellent book. I really enjoyed it. And it made me think a lot about religion and historical fiction. Because I know there's this Cromwell-a-thon going on, and I haven't been paying attention to it because I'll read to you from my grandfather's book. My grandfather wrote a memoir. There you go, A Miner's Life. Here's a picture of him right there. And I'll just read this to you. He said he was born in St. Helens in England. St. Helens was not a one-industry town. There were large glass and chemical factories and some cotton mills. The Irish had been a major part of the population since the famines of the 1840s. They assimilated easily, partly because English Catholics, with whom the Catholic Irish intermingled, were numerous in St. Helens. My parents were an example of this intermingling. My grandfather Brophy left Dublin in the 1840s as a young man and settled near Liverpool, where he met my grandmother, Bessie Carroll. She was born in Dundalk, Ireland, but was brought to England as a child. My mother's people, on the other hand, were English Catholics. It was a matter of pride with them that they had maintained the faith despite persecution and the defection of many. So, I come from a long line of English Catholics who weren't cowed into giving up their faith. And so, and my father, this guy was a real hero to him. And so I'm just not interested at all. In fact, let me read to you this prayer. This is a prayer that they found in St. Thomas More's Book of Hours that he kept with him in his cell in the Tower of London. So this is the man who's getting the short end of the stick right now. Here we go. Here's the prayer. Give me thy grace, good Lord, to set the world at naught, to set my mind fast upon thee, and not to hang upon the blast of men's mouths, to be content to be solitary, not to long for worldly company, little and little utterly to cast off the world, and rid my mind of all the business thereof, not to long to hear of any worldly things, but that the hearing of worldly fantasies may be to me displeasant, gladly to be thinking of God, piteously to call for his help, to lean unto the comfort of God, busily to labor to love him, to know my own vileness and wretchedness, to humble and meeken myself under the mighty hand of God, to bewail my sins past, for the purging of them patiently to suffer adversity, gladly to bear my purgatory here, to be joyful of tribulations, to walk the narrow way that leadeth to life, to bear the cross with Christ, to have the last thing in remembrance, to have ever afore mine eye my death that is ever at hand, to make death no stranger to me, to foresee and consider the everlasting fire of hell, to pray for pardon before the judge come, to have continually in mind the passion that Christ suffered for me, for his benefits uncessantly to give him thanks, to buy the time again that I before have lost, to abstain from vain confabulations, to eschew light, foolish mirth and gladness, recreations not necessary, to cut off of worldly substance, friends, liberty, life, and all, to set the loss at right, not for the winning of Christ, to think my most enemies my best friends. For the brethren of Joseph could never have done him so much good with their love and favor as they did him with their malice and hatred. These minds are more to be desired of every man than all the treasure of all the princes and kings, Christian and heathen, were it gathered and laid together all upon one heap. So that's the kind of man we're talking about. So I just finished reading Romola by George Eliot. George Eliot, I think she was an atheist. And yet she writes this religious novel that doesn't have to rewrite history. She's not revising history. She's working. I think good historical fiction can get into that time and place It's not anachronistic. It doesn't apply later things to former times. And yet it always recognizes the humanity and the same struggles and themes that go on in every generation, but also can use the limitations, knows the history, and uses those characters and those events honestly with integrity to create a great novel, to create a great story. And so that's what, trying to get it to come up here. That's what Romola does. George, I can't get it to come up now. I always have this trouble when I'm making a video. Anyway, it's a really, really well-written, deep book about this woman who marries this guy who's been shipwrecked. And he's Greek, and he's very handsome, and he's very learned. And she's the daughter of a scholar. And they've rejected Christianity, and so she's raised just, with the great writers of the ancient world. And she winds up marrying this guy, and it's what happens to her. And it's all about, fidelity to, what you owe your husband, what you owe your father, what you owe people who have mentored you, who have been there for you when you were at, when you were at rock bottom. It's a really, really well told story, and she presents the character. It's around the historical events of this Dominican preacher who wound up getting executed. His name is Savonarola, and I had heard the name before, but I didn't really know much about him. But he was this great preacher during the Renaissance in the 1490s, who was speaking out against all the corruption that was going on in the church at the time. But he was fanatical, and he got involved with the politics, and the politics, of Florence and in Italy at that time were just so vicious. And so he winds up getting himself into a very dangerous spot. But a lot of people really followed him and really believed in what he was preaching. In fact, he's the one that we had that expression, bonfire of the vanities, and that's due to this guy, Savonarola, because the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday, one year in the 1490s, I forget which year, probably later, 94 maybe or something like that. He had the people go around and give up all their luxuries and jewels and things like that and burn them. This would be right before Lent started, because he really felt, well, in this book, Eliot presents him as somebody who really cares about the poor and really speaks out against the rich who have all these luxuries while all these other people are, the poor are starving to death and that sort of thing. And so that was part of the thing, that they should give up these things, in penance for what they've done. Now, the whole time I was reading this book, because I didn't really know, I had heard the name and I vaguely knew about it, but I didn't remember any details whatsoever. So while I've been reading this book, I've been looking up articles, Wikipedia and the Catholic Encyclopedia and the Britannica and those sorts of places. And, I'd read something in Eliot's book, and I think, was that true? Was that really true? And then I go look it up, and yes, it was true. So the characters that she makes up, Romola and Tito and Bardo and Bernardo, all these people that she makes up, and they really just come off the page. They're really, fully formed characters But she doesn't. She creates them and puts them in the world. In that time of history, she's not bending any facts or anything like that. She might have a little bit of bias, but you really can't tell. I mean, it's a really rich, deep plumbing of all these issues, and really looking at religion, and the failures of the religious, and how hypocritical they often can be, but what is meaningful, or what is true, what remains that's true once you strip away all that. So I really, really enjoyed this book. I love George Eliot's, or Marianne Evans' writing style. This is the time of year I love to sink into a good, deep Victorian novel. January, there's not much to do outside, and so it's nice to cuddle up with a book that's really requires something from you. So I really enjoyed it. There were a few things in the book that I had a little bit of trouble with. One was just when Tito initially shows up, it really kind of puzzled me that this guy was shipwrecked and everybody just sort of took to him. So I don't know if she was trying to show something about that maybe the Florentines were kind of shallow, and because he spoke well, and he's supposed to be a really charming guy. The other thing I didn't quite get was nobody noticing that he had a particular relationship with this girl, Tessa, and he had a whole second family, and nobody seemed to notice that. I just thought it seemed like such a small town. People were always bumping into each other. It was just odd to me that he could just hide something so obvious. So I thought that kind of stretched believability. I also, as it went on, Romola, something happens. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but someone she loves a lot is unjustly done away with, and it's hard to explain this novel without giving stuff away, but she's almost like a bridge. Her husband is sort of a bridge between the two political parties that are fighting. So there's the Medicis, and then there's Savonarola's side that wants to sort of form a republic, so more of the people governing. Whereas the Medicis, were these old families, the old rich families that were running Florence. And so she's kind of a bridge because her father was a friend of the Medicis, but she also comes under the influence of Savonarola. So she's sort of a bridge, and her husband is too, because he's become a diplomat and sort of a messenger for both, and this kind of a secretary type. Another interesting thing about the book is that it sometimes mentions Machiavelli. So Machiavelli is a young man in this book, and at one point in the book, he's going to take over Tito's job, which I thought was neat. He's kind of a smart ass, Machiavelli. That's how he kind of comes off in this book. Anyway, there's so much to discuss about this book. There's really, really deep stuff, really really challenging, but in a good way. Really made you think about good and evil and just everything. It was a worthwhile read. I'm so grateful to Kate Howe for mentioning it, and because I think she was going to do a Victorian novel a month, and this was the one for January, and I really, really enjoyed reading it. So now I know I was going to say something else. Well, anyway, I've sort of been staying away from the whole Cromwell-a-thon because, like I said, I have just sort of a visceral, I just don't want to even, I don't have enough time, first of all, to indulge in that. And secondly, it's just sort of rubbing me the wrong way. No, go ahead and read it. It sounds really interesting and everything. I'm not passing judgment on anyone, but just for myself, that's just not the way I'm going to spend my time. But it made me, hearing that go on, and I saw Jay Shea's talk on Wolf Hall. And I just saw that a few minutes ago before I started this. I really appreciated his review of it. But, I'm just not going to get involved with it. But it did make me appreciate all the more, though I kept hearing about it, all the more just how brilliant Eliot is. You can't even tell she's an atheist. You cannot. It's all about the characters coming to life. And yet she has this integrity where it's completely based in the history of that time. She's a genius. She was a genius. She was just brilliant. So I really, really enjoyed this book. I would give it, I don't know, I don't give stars, but I would recommend it. If you're in the mood, it's not the easiest read in the world. She writes in a high style, it's kind of verbose in the way Victorian novels are verbose. Lots of quotes and, snippets of Latin and Italian and that sort of thing. References to classical figures, but I thought it was a very worthwhile novel, and I'm very glad I read it. Anyway, that's it. Bye bye.